A century of strife setting the stage, the 100 Years' War. Even the name sounds heavy with history. It wasn't a single war, not really. Imagine instead a brutal saga spanning generations, from 1337 to 1453. Picture a medieval tapestry woven with English longbows and French knights, castles under siege and fields soaked in blood. This wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a clash of cultures, of ambitions, of two kingdoms destined to be forever linked by conflict. Now, 100 years is a long time, right? Longer than most lifetimes back then. Think about it, grandparents dying, children born into war, never knowing peace. This wasn't some border skirmish, it was a fight for dominance, for the very soul of France. England, smaller, always punching above its weight, smelled weakness in the French crown. France, fractured and proud, refused to be anyone's vassal. What we're talking about is more than battles. Imagine the plague, the Black Death, ripping through both sides. Imagine the economic toll, the social upheaval. This war, it wasn't fought in some vacuum, it was a catalyst, speeding up changes already in motion, the decline of feudalism, the rise of new technologies, the very idea of nations starting to solidify. But before we get ahead of ourselves, we gotta go back to the source. Why did these two kingdoms, separated by a sliver of water, end up locked in a death grip for over a century? That, my friends, is where our story truly begins. Seeds of conflict, why war, why war? It's a question that echoes through every era. In the case of the 100 Years' War, the answer is a tangled mess of ambition, heritage, and economics. At the heart of it all, a throne. The French throne, to be precise. You see, the English kings weren't just content ruling their island, they had this ancestral claim to the French throne going back generations. Edward III of England, young and ambitious, saw a chance to grab power, and he wasn't afraid to use force. On the other side, the French naturally weren't too keen on having an English king. But it wasn't just about bloodlines. Control of the English Channel, that was vital for trade. Flanders, a region in what's now Belgium, was a cash cow for its wool production. England wanted that wealth, France aimed to keep it under its thumb. Economics and politics, always a dangerous cocktail. And let's not forget the historical baggage. Remember William the Conqueror? Yeah, the guy who conquered England in 1066? He was a Norman from France. So for centuries, there'd been this weird power dynamic between the two kingdoms. English kings controlling chunks of French land, French nobles with ties to the English court. It was a recipe for disaster. The spark that ignited the powder keg came in 1337. The French king, Philip VI, decided to confiscate a chunk of English territory in France. Edward III saw his chance. He declared himself the rightful king of France, and boom, the 100 Years' War was on. Clash of swords, key battles, and turning points. Now, this wasn't some gentlemanly duel. We're talking about a brutal back-and-forth slugfest that dragged on for generations. Early on, the English scored some shocking victories. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, man, that was a game-changer. English longbowmen, those guys were deadly. They rained arrows down on the French knights, decimating their ranks. Then came Poitiers in 1356, another crushing English victory, this time capturing the French king himself. Imagine the humiliation, the chaos. It seemed like England was on the verge of total victory. But the French, they're a resilient bunch. They rallied around a new king, Charles V, and started turning the tide. One turning point was the Siege of Orléans in 1429. Enter Joan of Arc, a young peasant woman who claimed divine visions. Talk about a wild card. She rallied the French troops and they broke the siege. Joan, she became a symbol of French resistance, a rallying cry against the English invaders. Of course, like many heroes, her story ends tragically. Captured by the English, she was burned at the stake as a heretic. But her sacrifice wasn't in vain. It galvanized the French, and they slowly but surely started pushing the English back. Faces of war leaders and heroes. Wars are fought by soldiers, led by kings and queens, but they're also shaped by individuals, by heroes and villains whose names echo through history. On the English side, you have Edward III, the ambitious king who started it all. Then there's his son, Edward the Black Prince, a brilliant military commander who won stunning victories at Crécy and Poitiers. But let's not forget the French. Charles V, the Wise, he picked up the pieces after the early defeats and laid the groundwork for France's comeback. And then there's Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans. She wasn't a king or a general, but her unwavering faith and courage made her a legend, a symbol of French resilience. But for every famous name, there were thousands of ordinary men and women who fought and died in the mud and blood. The English longbowmen, those yeoman farmers who trained from boyhood to become deadly archers. The French knights, once the epitome of chivalry, struggling to adapt to the changing face of warfare. And let's not forget the civilians, caught in the crossfire, their lives shattered by sieges, famine, and disease. These were the real faces of war, the forgotten millions whose stories are often lost to history. But it's their sacrifices, their courage, and their suffering that truly shaped the course of the 100 Years' War.